I know that you have just finished your test and that moving on to the new unit is not easy, but I really do need to use this 20 minutes that remains. And I thought maybe watching a video is a little easier than trying to get all of us together to do a short introductory presentation to our next unit. So we'll give this a try. You know that we are in the middle of discussing energy in living systems, and you have just done a great job looking at enzymes and ATP. And now what we're going to do is take a look at the two major processes that deal with energy in living systems. The first one of those is cellular respiration, and the second of those is photosynthesis. Luckily, a lot of the principles that we learn about in cellular respiration will be applicable to photosynthesis as well. But we're going to get started with cellular respiration. And there are several background pieces that I want to make sure you have under your belts before we get started. A couple of those we'll actually do tomorrow. So, big picture, we are looking at energy across living systems, which means that energy is going to be coming into living systems as light. The process of photosynthesis is going to trap that light energy, change its form into chemical energy, into the chemical bonds of organic molecules like glucose. And as a byproduct, oxygen is going to get produced. Those organic molecules are going to be stored for a while, and then they're going to be used. They're going to be needed by cells to do their molecular processes. And we release that energy in the process of cellular respiration. In eukaryotic organisms, that cellular respiration is going to occur mostly, not totally, but mostly in the mitochondria. And its goal, as all respiration is to make molecules of ATP, those small packets of energy in those phosphate bonds that can be spent to drive the reactions in cells. As a result of that, not only are we going to make ATP, but we're going to have a couple of byproducts, carbon dioxide and water. Those in turn are going to be used with the sunlight and be reformulated, dehydration synthesis back into the glucose molecules with an input of energy from sunlight, which will then enter into the mitochondria of the plants or the mitochondria of animals who eat the plants and be burned for photosynthesis. Excuse me, and be burned for respiratory processes. Respiration. Cellular respiration is going to take place in the mitochondrion. It's one of the two energy organelles in the cell. We have the chloroplast and we have the mitochondria. Because we need to know where things are going to occur, we need to quickly review the structure of the mitochondria. It has two membranes. We will talk about these as the inner membrane and the outer membrane. And then there's a space between them, that intermembrane space. We're going to end up pumping some ions here in this space. Then there is a huge infolding to increase the surface area of that inner membrane. We can refer to each of those infoldings as a crista, or many of them are cristae. And that's the surface area there is needed because we're going to embed a number of molecules. Most of these are going to be things like ATP synthase. There are going to be some electron acceptors that are going to need to be repeated over and over and over throughout this mitochondria. Then we want to refer to the middle of the mitochondria as the matrix. The matrix is where some reactions are going to take place, like the Krebs cycle. There are going to be some important enzymes that occur there. And then it is where the hydrogen ions that eventually are going to get pumped across the membrane are going to primarily reside. So that's what the mitochondria looks like in its structure. Here's a quick video that shows you in a nice animation.
Our body is made up of trillions of cells. They all require energy to function. This energy is created within our cells, in the mitochondria. Here, food is converted into chemical energy called ATP. ATP is released by the mitochondria so cells can use it. Mitochondria consist of two membranes, an outer membrane separating it from the cytosol, and an inner membrane surrounding the so-called matrix. The area between these membranes is called the intermembrane space. ATP is generated at the inner membrane of mitochondria by an efficient mechanism called oxidative phosphorylation.
So that's the first thing we wanted to review. The second thing we need to review is something from chemistry. So way back in 10th grade, you probably were introduced to the idea of oxidation reduction reactions. And this fellow here does a pretty good job of reviewing what oxidation reduction reactions are. When he's done, we're going to work through 2 examples and show you how they work in living systems.
This video is an introduction to oxidation reduction reactions. We often abbreviate oxidation and reduction, so we just call these redox reactions for short. So, what is an oxidation reduction or redox reaction? Here's a quick definition. In oxidation reduction reactions, electrons move between atoms. Check out this diagram here. We got atom A and atom B, and there's an electron moving out of atom A into atom B. So this is definitely an oxidation reduction reaction because there's an electron moving between the atoms. Now, we can describe the movement of this electron using the words oxidation and reduction. So let's learn specifically what both of these mean. Reduction is a gain of electrons. I know this seems kind of confusing because usually when you have a reduction of something, you have less of it. We'll talk later about why a gain of electrons is called a reduction. But anyway, reduction, gain of electrons, and then oxidation, which is a loss of electrons. So we got reduction and oxidation. What's happening to atoms A and B over here? Well, atom A is giving up one of its electrons. It's losing an electron. So at atom A, oxidation is taking place. Atom B is receiving an electron. It's gaining an electron. So at atom B, reduction is taking place. Now, we can modify these words slightly to come up with terms we use to describe what's happening to the atoms. Atom A is undergoing oxidation, so we can say that atom A is being oxidized. Atom B is undergoing reduction, so we can say that atom B is being reduced. So we got oxidation, oxidized, reduction, reduced. The big picture here is that reduction is a gain of electrons and oxidation is a loss. So I don't know about you, but when I was first learning this stuff, I found it so confusing. Why should a reduction be a gain of electrons? Usually when you're reducing something, you're getting less of it. So here's one thing that might be helpful to think about. That's that electrons have negative charge. So as you add electrons to something, its charge goes down. The more electrons you add, the lower the charge. So as you add electrons, as electrons are gained, the charge reduces. So that might be helpful to keep in mind to have this make a little bit more sense. Still, these things can be really confusing to remember. So here are a couple really great mnemonics. First is the term oil rig. This is the name of one of those big structures you use to drill for oil. OIL stands for oxidation is loss, and RIG stands for reduction is gain. So it's a really good mnemonic. Here's another one you might like if you like animals. Leo the lion says grr, all right? LEO stands for loss of electrons is oxidation, and grr stands for gain of electrons is reduction. So learn one or both of these. It'll be a great way that you can always remember what reduction is and what oxidation is. Okay, oxidation and reduction happen in all sorts of chemical reactions. They're like the super important thing that makes those reactions happen, that makes them go. So to learn more about this stuff, we're going to have to look at an example of a chemical reaction where oxidation and reduction are taking place.
And that's what we're going to take over here. So the one thing that this young man did not address was the important energy changes that are associated with oxidation and reduction. And that's why we're going to emphasize oxidation and reduction in respiration and photosynthesis, because of the energy changes that are going to take place. So in oxidation and reduction, we want to follow these electrons, and where the electrons go, that's where the energy is going to go. So when we oxidize a compound here, so we have A, it has a couple of electrons. When we take those electrons off and we give them to B, A is going to lose energy and B is going to gain energy. And what we're going to be talking about a lot are these high energy electrons that are associated with glucose, and we're going to give them to something else, which is going to gain that energy and do something with that energy. But let's kind of look fairly quickly at this very straightforward example of oxidation and reduction. We're going to look at sodium and chloride, and this is the balanced equation, but we're just going to simplify things and say, here's sodium and here's chlorine. And when I look at their electron dot diagrams and I see how many electrons are in their outermost shell, we can see that sodium just has one electron in its outermost shell. When I look at chlorine, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So clearly, to be satisfied, sodium needs to give up one of its electrons and chlorine needs to gain one of those electrons. So we would have sodium donate its electrons to chlorine, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in this example then, sodium has lost an electron. So it's got one more proton than it does electrons. Chlorine has gained an electron, one more electron than it has protons. So it would have a net negative charge there. But importantly, the sodium has been oxidized. It has lost an electron, and the chlorine has been reduced. Now, we talked earlier in the year how once that occurs, the sodium and the chlorine can now form an ionic bond because there's going to be an attraction between the positive sodium and the negative chlorine. We're not concerned right now so much about forming that bond as we are about the transfer of those electrons. So this is a complete loss of electrons for the sodium and a complete gain of electrons for that chlorine. That doesn't always happen. In fact, in the organic molecules that we're going to talk about, that's not very common. So we're going to look at this organic compound, which is, whoops, that's supposed to be a 4. So we're going to look at methane burned in the presence of oxygen. And we're going to find out that the end products of that reaction are carbon dioxide and water. But more important than the products are what happens with electrons. So let's take a look at carbon and hydrogen in methane. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogens with that methane. And each of those bonds is going to share 2 electrons between those bonds. Now, if you recall, carbon and hydrogen have a very small electronegativity difference. And because they have a very small electronegativity difference, these electrons that are being shared are going to spend their time equally or nearly equally around the hydrogen and the carbon. Here they are again, spending equal amount of time around the hydrogen and the carbon. And that goes for all of these electrons in all of these bonds. Let's look at oxygen. So here's one oxygen atom, here's another. Turns out that they actually share 2 electrons with one another. There's a double bond that's going in there. Well, the difference, the electronegativity difference between 2 oxygen atoms, because they're the same kind of atom, has got to be 0. So these electrons, again, are going to be shared equally between those 2 atoms. But now let's look at the products. In the products, we have carbon dioxide. And again, it turns out that those are going to be double bonds. Well, what do we know about, what do we know about the electronegativity difference between oxygen and carbon? Well, recall, anytime we see oxygen, we can be pretty assured that that electronegativity difference between those 2 is relatively large, which means oxygen is going to pull those electrons away from that carbon. So if I drew it correctly, I should really have drawn these electrons here much closer to the oxygen. They're going to spend much more of their time around the oxygen than they are around the carbon. So effectively, the carbon here, which had been sharing electrons fairly equally with the hydrogen, has now lost electrons much of the time. And oxygen has effectively gained electrons. When we look at water, there's the oxygen, there's the hydrogen, there's the hydrogen. We know that those electrons are going to spend their time around hydrogen. We've studied water enough to know that. And so hydrogen here has effectively, let's say what I really want to emphasize is that the oxygen has effectively gained electrons. It effectively has been reduced. It doesn't have electrons around it as often as it used to. It has electrons around it more often than it used to when it was in an oxygen-oxygen bond. So there's not a complete loss of electrons in either of these products. Everything is neutral, but the positioning of the electrons has changed. They are spending their time away from the carbon, so carbon has been oxidized, and around the oxygen, so the oxygen has been reduced. And there's an energy change as a result of that. When you burn methane in the presence of oxygen, it's likely to be quite an explosion. There's quite an energy loss. Now, living things don't burn methane. They're going to burn other organic compounds that have this carbon-hydrogen bond, and they're going to trap that energy in molecules of ATP. And the details of that is how cellular respiration works. Here's a nice diagram that is in your textbook that illustrates what we just talked about, how those electrons are being shared pretty equally between the hydrogen and the carbon, but when carbon dioxide is formed, those electrons are spending more of their time around the oxygen, less around the carbon. Here, the electrons are spending about equal time around each oxygen, but in water, they're spending more of their time around the oxygen and not nearly as much time around the hydrogen. So oxygen has been reduced. It has gained those electrons. And in respiration, what we're really about to study, what we're going to find out is that electrons here in this glucose molecule are going to be what's lost from the glucose. So you can kind of think ahead. We have carbon, we have hydrogen, we have oxygen, and when we follow oxidation reduction in living systems, we can also follow the hydrogens. The hydrogens are going to come off when the electrons come off. And so you'll notice we have glucose with lots of hydrogens, but CO2 no longer has any hydrogens. So we're going to be able to follow electrons in living systems when we follow the hydrogen.